They weren't just films. They were battlefields projected on silver screens, crafted by men who had actually been there. When Britain reeled from the Blitz, its filmmakers turned real pain into celluloid courage. But which of these war stories still move the very soldiers who live them? Let's dive into 12 British WWII films veterans still recommend, where truth met sacrifice and real met real. Number 12. The Cruel Sea, 1953. When The Cruel Sea hit cinemas, it wasn't just another naval drama. It was a mirror. Veterans watched and many wept. Adapted from Nicholas Montserrat's novel, the film charted the relentless Atlantic battles of a Royal Navy corvette, Compass Rose, fighting U-boats and the unforgiving sea itself. Jack Hawkins, playing Captain Erickson, embodied quiet leadership, haunted, humane, and hardened by loss. The film didn't glorify war. It endured it. Its black and white cinematography, often filmed in storm tanks at Pinewood Studios, gave audiences an almost documentary sense of realism. The salt, the spray, the screams, they felt authentic because so many of the crew and extras were former sailors themselves. Behind the scenes, producer Leslie Norman faced brutal conditions. Cameras froze, engines flooded, and one mock torpedo explosion nearly derailed the shoot. Yet the production refused to fake courage. "This is not a war of heroes," Montserrat had said, "but of endurance, and that's far harder." Critics praised it as one of the most emotionally honest portrayals of naval life ever made. It was bleak, stoic, and deeply British. Veterans called it too real, recalling nights in freezing waters when courage meant simply staying alive until dawn. Decades later, The Cruel Sea remains a naval masterpiece, its minimal score and silences echoing the loneliness of command. For many old sailors, this was the first time cinema didn't lie about what war demanded. Everything. Number 11. The Dam Busters, 1955. Before Top Gun had its aces, Britain had The Dam Busters, a film so stirring that RAF veterans still quote it by heart. Based on the real Operation Chastise of 1943, it told the story of Wing Commander Guy Gibson and his daring plan to destroy German dams using the revolutionary bouncing bomb, designed by engineer Barnes Wallis. When it premiered, the film became a phenomenon. Families packed cinemas, cheering as Lancaster bombers roared across the screen. Yet behind the patriotic fanfare lay an undercurrent of grief, the kind only real airmen understood. Director Michael Anderson filmed using genuine RAF bases and surviving aircraft, blending precision with poignancy. What few knew was the controversy brewing beneath its wings. Some military officials balked at how much classified engineering was revealed on screen. Others feared the portrayal of Gibson, brilliant yet arrogant, might tarnish the RAF's heroic image. In later years, its inclusion of Gibson's dog's offensive name drew censorship debates, leading to cuts and disclaimers. The film's theme music, Eric Coates's March, became almost a second national anthem, played at air shows and remembrance events. But veterans often said the quiet moments were truer. The empty bunks, the shadows in the mess hall, the final flight that never returned. When Peter Jackson began planning a remake, surviving crewmen advised him, "Don't modernize the bravery, show the fear." Because The Dam Busters wasn't just about explosions. It was about men who knew they might not come back, and went anyway. For veterans, it remains not just recommended, but revered. Number 10. Went the Day Well? 1942. Released at the height of the Second World War, Went the Day Well? Wasn't just entertainment, it was a warning wrapped in fiction. Directed by Alberto Cavalcanti for Ealing Studios, this eerie wartime thriller imagined what would happen if a quiet English village was infiltrated by German soldiers disguised as British troops. The premise was chilling, an invasion not on distant shores, but right at home. Ordinary villagers, from the postmistress to the vicar, discover the truth and take up arms in brutal, desperate defense. When the film first hit cinemas, British audiences were shaken. It was propaganda, yes, but also a reflection of real fear. This wasn't about hero generals. It was about you, your neighbors, your street. Behind the camera, Cavalcanti, a Brazilian expatriate with documentary roots, brought a terrifying realism to every frame. He refused to romanticize war. The violence was shocking for its time. women stabbing soldiers, children acting as lookouts, gunfire echoing through the countryside. The Ministry of Information almost censored several scenes, worried they might unsettle public morale, but the government ultimately approved it, deciding fear might be a necessary motivator. Veterans loved it for another reason. They said it showed why they fought, to keep that nightmare from becoming real. The film also holds a strange historical irony. It predicted tactics the Nazis actually used later in the war, including infiltration through disguise. Decades later, Went the Day Well? Remains a haunting masterpiece of British wartime cinema, part thriller, part social snapshot. It reminds viewers that courage doesn't always wear a uniform. Sometimes it hides in an English farmhouse, waiting for the knock that will change everything. Number 9. The Bridge on the River Kwai, 1957. Though directed by David Lean and funded internationally, The Bridge on the River Kwai is deeply British in spirit and in tragedy. Set in a Japanese POW camp, the film follows British officers forced to build a railway bridge for their captors. Colonel Nicholson, played with magnetic pride by Alec Guinness, becomes obsessed with proving British superiority through discipline, even as his men starve and suffer. When it premiered, veterans had mixed emotions. Some saw it as a masterpiece. Others called it betrayal. "We didn't collaborate," said one former prisoner. "We survived." Yet even critics admitted Lean's direction captured something deeper, the madness of duty, the thin line between honor and insanity. Behind the scenes, production in the jungles of Ceylon was as punishing as the story itself. Cast and crew battled disease, flooding, and infighting. Guinness reportedly hated the heat so much he begged Lean to end filming early. Meanwhile, real survivors of the Burma Railway quietly protested, arguing that the film softened the horrors they endured. But history gave Kwai the last word. It won 7 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, and its iconic whistled march, the Colonel Bogey March, became synonymous with British endurance under impossible pressure. Yet, for veterans, the haunting final explosion symbolized something else: the destruction of blind pride and the madness of war itself. Even today, when soldiers discuss leadership gone wrong, Kwai resurfaces. It's not a celebration. It's a warning. And that's why veterans still recommend it, not for glory, but for truth. Number 8. The Way to the Stars, 1945. Released just before the war's end, The Way to the Stars captured something no propaganda reel could: grief with dignity. Directed by Anthony Asquith, the film told the story of RAF pilots stationed in a small English town, charting their friendships, romances, and quiet losses over time. Rather than heroic speeches or grand battles, it focused on pauses: the sound of a radio fading, an empty chair in the mess, a letter read by someone who never received a reply. Starring John Mills, Michael Redgrave, and a young Trevor Howard, it became a touchstone for servicemen who had lived those silences. It wasn't universally loved at first. Some critics called it too slow, too sentimental. But veterans disagreed. They said it felt real. The film's dialogue, sparse and understated, mirrored the emotional restraint of an entire generation who buried their pain under stoicism. Behind the scenes, Asquith drew heavily from real RAF diaries and base reports. Many extras were actual servicemen waiting for demobilization. One of them later recalled, "We didn't have to act. We just lost friends last week." When peace finally came, audiences returned to The Way to the Stars, not for excitement, but for remembrance. It offered something few war films dared: empathy for survivors, the quiet dignity of those who kept going day after day, while others never came home. For veterans, it remains one of the truest portrayals of wartime Britain. Not about victory, but about endurance, camaraderie, and the price of saying goodbye. Number 7. A Matter of Life and Death, 1946. When A Matter of Life and Death premiered, no one quite knew what to make of it. Was it fantasy, propaganda, philosophy disguised as cinema? Directed by Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, this Technicolor masterpiece dared to humanize war through surrealism, and veterans loved it for exactly that reason. The story begins with RAF pilot Peter Carter, played by David Niven, who bails out of his doomed aircraft without a parachute. Against all odds, he survives, But heaven insists it was a clerical error. As celestial bureaucrats argue over whether he should have died, Carter falls in love with the radio operator who heard his final words. At first glance, it's pure whimsy. But beneath its dreamlike visuals lies a profound reflection on wartime trauma and survivors' guilt. Veterans saw in Carter's hallucinations the struggle of returning airmen who couldn't reconcile why they lived while others perished. Behind the scenes, the film's technical feats were revolutionary. Its transitions between monochrome, heaven, and vivid Technicolor Earth symbolized the divide between life and death, duty and desire. Powell and Pressburger clashed with censors who feared its depiction of heaven as a bureaucratic office might offend religious groups. Even so, the Ministry of Information approved it, calling it spiritual morale for the weary. Decades later, critics hailed it as a work of psychological genius. Veterans still recommend it because it wasn't just about war. It was about what comes after, the love, the loss, and the haunting question every soldier asked, why me? Number 6. The Desert Rats, 1953. Though co-produced with American funding, The Desert Rats remains a quintessentially British tale of grit under fire. Starring Richard Burton as a young officer and James Mason reprising his role as Rommel, the film dramatized the siege of Tobruk, where a handful of Allied soldiers held off German forces in the scorching North African desert. The film's reputation was complicated. Some called it Hollywood heroism. Others, especially veterans of Tobruk, recognized its authenticity. Burton, a former RAF trainee, delivered one of his earliest powerful performances, haunted, proud, and deeply human. Veterans said his portrayal captured the exhaustion and stubborn resilience they knew too well. Filming in Australia under brutal heat, director Robert Wise insisted on historical precision. Real Australian soldiers were used as extras, and the dusty realism of their conditions, sand in rations, blinding sunlight, felt painfully accurate. But the production wasn't without friction. The British press accused the film of Americanizing the victory, while American censors trimmed dialogue that implied imperial arrogance. Despite controversy, The Desert Rats became a symbol of Allied unity. Veterans who fought in North Africa found in it a rare cinematic honesty. Men who joked, suffered, and defied defeat not out of glory, but survival. The film's greatest strength wasn't its explosions, but its moments of silence. The look between soldiers who understood they might not last another dawn. In the decades since, The Desert Rats has become a quiet veteran favorite. A reminder that bravery sometimes looks like holding the line, sandstorm after sandstorm, with no medals guaranteed. Number 5. In Which We Serve, 1942. No list of veteran-approved British war films could omit In Which We Serve. Co-directed by Noel Coward and a young David Lean, this film was born not in Hollywood boardrooms, but in the smoldering ruins of wartime London. It was Britain's cinematic call to endurance, a film by the people, for the people. Coward, typically known for witty plays and aristocratic airs, stunned critics by writing, producing, and starring as Captain Kinross, loosely based on Lord Mountbatten. The story follows the crew of HMS Torrin, a destroyer sunk during battle, as its survivors cling to wreckage and recall their lives, loves, and comrades left behind. Released during the darkest year of the war, it became an instant phenomenon. Civilians saw their husbands, brothers, and sons reflected in those faces. Soldiers saw truth without embellishment, mud, fear, and sacrifice rendered with quiet dignity. Churchill himself reportedly endorsed it, calling it a film every Briton should see. Behind the scenes, the production faced impossible odds. Bombing raids interrupted filming, extras were called back to active service, and sets were built in blackout conditions. Coward clashed with Lean over realism, but that tension created magic. Lean's cinematic precision balanced Coward's emotional poetry. When it premiered, many veterans openly wept. The film didn't sugarcoat loss, yet it offered something powerful: unity. In the end, as the sailors drift across the sea, they sing, "We're all part of the same ship." For Britain's wartime generation, that wasn't metaphor. It was memory. Today, In Which We Serve endures not as propaganda, but as testimony. It reminds audiences that heroism isn't loud. It's the courage to keep calm and carry on when everything around you is sinking. Number 4. The Colditz Story, 1955. In post-war Britain, The Colditz Story was more than a movie. It was an anthem of defiance. Based on Major P.R. Reid's best-selling memoir, the film retold the true story of Allied officers imprisoned in Colditz Castle, a supposedly escape-proof Nazi fortress. But for the captured British, impossible was just a challenge. Directed by Guy Hamilton, himself a Royal Navy veteran who later helmed several Bond films, the production crackled with authenticity. Starring John Mills and Eric Portman, the film depicted a labyrinth of tunnels, coded messages, and audacious plans that kept both guards and viewers guessing. There were no CGI effects or glossy heroics, just claustrophobic realism steeped in sweat, fear, and ingenuity. During production, real Colditz escapees served as advisors. They corrected dialogue, reviewed sets, and even laughed at their own reckless memories. One consultant, a former POW, reportedly burst into tears when he saw the rebuilt castle interior. "It's too real," he whispered. Critics lauded the film's restraint. There was no romantic subplot, no exaggerated villainy, just the quiet endurance of men determined not to surrender their dignity. Yet controversy simmered. The War Office initially worried it might glamorize escape attempts, potentially encouraging copycat bravado among younger soldiers. But veterans defended it fiercely, arguing it honored the ingenuity that defined the British spirit. The Colditz Story became required viewing in officer training programs, hailed as a model of discipline and persistence. To this day, veterans admire its respect for intelligence over violence. In war, it suggested, victory isn't always about firepower. It's about wit, patience, and the refusal to give up, no matter how thick the walls. Number 3. The Guns of Navarone, 1961. Before Hollywood blockbusters had their formula, The Guns of Navarone set the standard. Adapted from Alistair MacLean's novel, it was part action thriller, part moral debate. And though American studios financed it, its heart was unmistakably British. Gregory Peck, David Niven, and Anthony Quinn played commandos sent to destroy massive German artillery, threatening Allied ships in the Aegean. The mission? Impossible. The tension? Unbearable. The courage? Absolute. But what elevated Navarone wasn't its explosions, it was its soul. Director J. Lee Thompson infused the film with psychological realism. Niven's character, a weary explosives expert, captured the British veteran's mindset, bravery laced with disillusionment. "We're not heroes," he mutters at one point. "We're survivors." Veterans embraced that honesty. Behind the scenes, filming in roads in the Mediterranean was grueling. Cast and crew endured storms, illness, and even political unrest. Niven nearly died from a leg infection, halting production for weeks. Yet, despite chaos, the film triumphed, earning critical praise and massive box office success. Some historians criticized it for romanticizing war, but veterans disagreed. "It showed what teamwork meant," one former commando said. "We weren't supermen. We were men who refused to fail." The Guns of Navarone became a symbol of Allied cooperation and British ingenuity under impossible odds. Its influence echoed across decades, from Where Eagles Dare to Saving Private Ryan. For those who fought, it represented what they remembered most: camaraderie forged under pressure and the fragile hope that one bold act could change the course of war. Number 2. The Hill, 1965. Not all war happens on the front lines. The Hill, directed by Sidney Lumet and starring Sean Connery, dared to show the psychological war within the ranks, a brutal drama set in a North African British Army prison camp. Here, soldiers are punished not for cowardice, but for humanity itself. Connery, fresh off his Bond fame, stripped away his suave persona to play a rebellious sergeant who challenges authority in a system gone mad. The hill of the title is a man-made mound of sand prisoners are forced to climb repeatedly under the blazing sun, a punishment so cruel it becomes metaphorical. At the time, audiences were unprepared. There were no heroics, no glory, just bureaucracy, cruelty, and moral decay. Some critics called it too grim, while others hailed it as one of the boldest anti-war statements ever made. British censors hesitated, fearing its critique of military leadership might damage recruitment morale. Behind the scenes, filming in Almeria, Spain, tested everyone. Temperatures reached 120 degrees Celsius, and Lumet refused to fake exhaustion. Actors had to climb the hill for real. Connery later called it the most physically demanding role of my life. Veterans, however, saw in it a dark truth. War didn't just break bodies. It broke systems. Many POWs and enlisted men related to the hierarchy, the blind obedience and the quiet rebellion that defined their service. For veterans, the hill stands as a brutal, necessary mirror. It reminded them that courage wasn't only in battle, it was also in standing against injustice within your own ranks. British Veteran, their most respected WWII film, and most will name Ice Cold